Right now, social media is filled with claims that the next Federal Reserve chair has a hidden plan to erase America's nearly $39 trillion national debt. Some people are calling it a financial reset. Others are saying the debt will somehow be canceled, wiped away, or made irrelevant overnight. But the truth is more complicated than that. The real story is not that America's debt will magically disappear. The real story is that there is an old financial playbook that governments have used before when debt became too large to manage normally. And this playbook does not erase debt directly. It slowly reduces the real value of debt by making money worth less over time. That process has a name. It is called financial repression. And if you understand how it works, you will understand why Wall Street, large institutions, banks, asset owners, and serious investors are watching the Federal Reserve so closely right now. Because the decisions made in the coming years could affect the value of every dollar you save, every bond you hold, every stock you own, and every asset in your portfolio. So today we are going to separate reality from hype. We are going to look at what is actually true, what is exaggerated, what history tells us, and what kind of positioning ordinary investors need to think about if America enters a long period of financial repression. This is Dalio Marco Mind. Let's begin with the number everyone is talking about. $39 trillion. That is roughly the size of the United States national debt. For most people, that number is almost impossible to imagine. $1 trillion is already beyond normal human understanding, but when the debt reaches tens of trillions, it becomes so large that it starts to feel unreal. But it is very real. And the problem is not only the total debt, the bigger problem is the speed at which that debt is growing. The U.S. national debt has been increasing by trillions of dollars in a very short period of time. Every day, billions of dollars are added. And while most people are going to work paying bills, saving money, and trying to protect their future, the debt machine continues to grow in the background. But even that is not the most dangerous part. The most dangerous part is the interest. The United States now spends around $1 trillion a year just on interest payments, not paying down the debt, not reducing the principal, just paying the cost of borrowing. That interest bill has become one of the largest expenses in the federal budget. It competes with defense, infrastructure, education, healthcare, and other major government priorities. And when interest payments become this large, the government faces a very difficult question. How do you fix it? There are only a few possible options. The first option is to raise taxes, but raising taxes enough to solve a multi-trillion-dollar debt problem is politically difficult and economically painful. Even if the government taxed the very wealthy much more aggressively, it would still not solve the entire structural problem. The second option is to cut spending. But that is also extremely difficult because most government spending goes toward programs that are politically sensitive, such as Social Security, Medicare, defense, and interest payments. Cutting these areas deeply would create massive political resistance. The third option is to grow the economy faster than the debt. In theory, this is the cleanest solution. If the economy grows strongly enough, the debt becomes smaller relative to the size of the economy. But the problem is that debt has been growing faster than the economy. So unless growth becomes much stronger and government borrowing slows down, this option alone is not enough. So what is left? There is one final option: make every dollar worth less over time. That does not sound like an official policy. No politician will stand in front of voters and say, "We are going to reduce your purchasing power so the debt becomes easier to manage." But historically, this is exactly what governments have done. They allow inflation to run above interest rates for a long period of time. This slowly reduces the real value of debt. The debt still exists on paper, but the money used to repay it becomes weaker. That is the heart of financial repression, and this is where the Federal Reserve becomes so important. Many people believe the Federal Reserve is simply a normal government agency, but the structure of the Federal Reserve is more complex than that. The Fed includes 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. These regional banks have private member banks connected to them. Commercial banks hold stock in their regional Federal Reserve banks, and the system is designed in a way that gives banks a formal role inside the structure. This does not mean every Fed decision is a secret conspiracy. It does not mean there is a dark room where everything is planned in silence. But it does mean something very important. The financial system is built in a way that protects banks, large institutions, asset owners, and the stability of markets first. And when a debt problem becomes too large, the solution usually does not hurt everyone equally. Some people lose purchasing power, some people protect wealth, and some people benefit massively. The people who usually benefit are the people who own assets, stocks, real estate, gold, businesses, productive companies, scarce hard assets. The people who usually lose are the people who hold too much cash, rely only on fixed wages, sit in low-yield savings accounts, or hold long-term bonds during periods of rising inflation. This is why understanding the system matters, because the system does not need to announce a reset for a reset to happen. It can happen slowly, quietly, year after year, through inflation, interest rates, currency debasement, and policy decisions that transfer wealth from savers to asset owners. Now let's look at the claims going viral online. People are saying the next Federal Reserve chair will come in and immediately cut interest rates aggressively. They are saying the Fed will shrink its balance sheet. They are saying artificial intelligence will boost productivity and reduce inflation. And they are saying this entire process will make America's debt problem manageable. There are pieces of truth inside that story. The U.S. debt problem is real. The interest burden is real. The Federal Reserve balance sheet is still extremely large. Financial repression is a real policy framework, and governments have used it before, but the exaggerated part is the idea that there is one secret plan that will cancel the debt overnight. That is not how this works. There is no magic switch. There is no single day when America wakes up and the debt disappears. There is no simple button that the Federal Reserve Chair can press to erase $39 trillion. The Federal Reserve Chair has influence, but the chair does not act alone. Fed policy is decided by a committee. There are multiple voting members, and interest rate decisions require broader agreements. So the idea that one person alone can walk into the Federal Reserve and instantly reset the entire debt system is misleading. The real story is slower, more subtle, and more dangerous. The U.S. will likely move toward an environment where inflation is allowed to run above the return paid to savers and bondholders for long periods of time. That means the government may not default in the traditional way, but the value of the currency slowly declines. That is how debt becomes easier to manage, not by canceling it, by shrinking it in real terms. This has happened before. After World War II, the United States had a massive debt burden. The country had spent enormous amounts of money to finance the war. By 1946, U.S. debt was more than 100% of GDP. That means the debt was larger than the entire annual output of the economy. Many people were worried. They wondered how America would ever manage such a huge debt load. But over the following decades, the debt-to-GDP ratio fell dramatically. It did not fall because the government suddenly paid everything back. It did not fall because of one miracle policy. It fell because of a combination of growth, inflation, controlled interest rates, and financial repression. The government kept interest rates relatively low. Inflation reduced the real value of money. Banks and institutions were encouraged or required to hold government bonds. Savers were paid interest rates that often failed to keep up with inflation. The debt remained on paper, but its real burden shrank. This is the hidden tax. Inflation silently takes value from cash holders and fixed income savers. Nobody sends you a bill. Nobody calls it a tax, but your money buys less over time. Imagine you lend someone $100. 10 years later, they still pay you back $100, but during those 10 years, prices doubled. Technically, you got your $100 back, but in real purchasing power, you only got back half of what you originally lent. That is how inflation reduces debt. And that is why governments often prefer inflation over painful spending cuts or obvious tax hikes. Inflation is politically easier. It is less visible. Most people feel it, but they do not always understand who caused it or how it works. That is why the biggest danger for ordinary people is not always a dramatic financial crash. Sometimes the biggest danger is slow erosion. Your bank balance may look the same, your salary may go up slightly, your savings may still exist, but your purchasing power quietly disappears. This is the real risk, not that the U.S. suddenly defaults like a smaller country that borrows in a foreign currency. The United States issues debt in its own currency. It can always create more dollars. The risk is that those dollars become worth less over time. That is very different from default. But for ordinary people, the damage can feel similar. If your money loses purchasing power, your standard of living falls. If wages fail to keep up with real inflation, workers get poorer. If savings accounts pay less than inflation, savers lose. If bond yields stay below inflation, bondholders lose. This is why investors need to think differently. You cannot measure wealth only by the number of dollars in your account. You have to measure wealth by what those dollars can buy. Can they buy the same amount of food, the same amount of energy, the same amount of housing, the same amount of gold, the same share of productive companies, the same quality of life? That is the real measurement. And during financial repression, the people who understand this early have a major advantage. The first step is to understand the real risk. The risk is not simply debt. The risk is currency dilution. The risk is inflation staying higher than interest rates. The risk is watching your money lose value while official numbers make everything look manageable. The second step is to understand what usually performs better in that kind of environment. Historically, assets with scarcity, pricing power, or productive value tend to offer better protection. High-quality businesses can raise prices when their costs rise. Strong companies with real cash flow can survive inflation better than weak companies. Real estate can benefit because replacement costs rise and rents may increase over time. Gold and silver can act as monetary hedges when confidence in paper currency declines. Hard assets, commodities, land, energy, infrastructure, and productive businesses often become more important when the value of currency is being slowly diluted. But this does not mean every asset automatically wins. Quality matters, timing matters, valuation matters, risk management matters. Buying anything blindly just because inflation exists can still lead to losses. The third step is to avoid the traps. One trap is holding too much cash because it feels safe. Cash feels stable because the number does not move. But if inflation is quietly reducing its purchasing power, cash is not truly safe over long periods. Another trap is locking money into long-duration bonds when inflation may run higher than expected. If you lock in a low interest rate and prices rise faster than that rate, the real value of those payments gets crushed. Another trap is concentration. Some people put everything into technology stocks. Some put everything into gold. Some put everything into crypto. Some put everything into real estate. Some put everything into cash. But concentration can be dangerous. In a changing financial system, money moves from one area to another. Markets rotate. Leadership changes. Assets that look safe in one phase can become vulnerable in another. The goal is not panic. The goal is positioning. A smart investor does not need to believe every viral claim online. A smart investor needs to understand the direction of policy, the incentives of the government, and the historical pattern. And the historical pattern is clear. When governments face debt levels that are too large to manage normally, they rarely choose the most painful solution. They rarely choose deep spending cuts. They rarely choose direct default if they control their own currency. They rarely choose honest sacrifice. Instead, they choose the path that is easiest to hide. They choose inflation. They choose negative real interest rates. They choose financial repression. They choose to slowly reduce the real value of debt by reducing the real value of money. And that means the coming years may be very different from the last several decades. For years, many people believed cash was safe, bonds were stable, and inflation was temporary. But if the system enters a long financial repression cycle, those assumptions may break. Savers could be punished. Asset owners could be rewarded. People who understand the playbook could protect themselves. People who ignore it could watch their purchasing power disappear without understanding why. So let's bring this all together. The viral secret plan story is partly true and partly exaggerated. America's debt problem is real. The interest burden is real. The pressure on the Federal Reserve is real. The possibility of financial repression is real, but there is no simple magic plan that cancels $39 trillion overnight. The more likely outcome is slower and quieter. The government and central bank allow inflation to do part of the work. They keep interest rates below inflation. They reduce the real value of debt over time. And wealth slowly transfers from people who hold paper promises to people who own real assets. This is not a prediction of instant collapse. It is not a call to panic. It is a warning to understand the system before the system moves against you. Because the difference between Wall Street and Main Street is often not intelligence. It is access to the playbook. Wall Street understands how policy changes affect markets. Wall Street understands how money moves when rates fall, inflation rises, and currencies weaken. Wall Street understands that debt problems are rarely solved honestly. They are usually managed through the currency. And once you understand that, you stop asking whether the debt will be canceled. You ask a better question: who will pay for it? Because history gives us the answer. Savers pay, cash holders pay, fixed income workers pay, bondholders pay, people without assets pay, and asset owners are protected. That is the real reset, not a dramatic announcement, not a single policy speech, not a secret document, but a long, quiet transfer of wealth through inflation, interest rates, and currency debasement. So the most important thing is this: do not be distracted by hype. Do not wait for an official reset. Do not assume your dollars will always hold the same value. Understand the playbook. Watch the Federal Reserve. Watch inflation. Watch real interest rates. Watch government debt. Watch how money moves into hard assets and productive assets. Because if financial repression becomes the path forward, the people who prepare early may protect their wealth, and the people who ignore it may only realize what happened after their money has already lost its power.